When Bryan Kohberger accepted a plea deal that removed the death penalty from the table, many people assumed he had achieved the best outcome possible under the circumstances. Instead of facing execution, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. No death row, no execution date, no waiting for years to learn when his life would end. At first glance, it looked like a victory, but within weeks of entering prison, a very different picture began to emerge. Reports began surfacing about complaints he was filing behind bars, complaints about food, complaints about prison conditions, complaints about life inside one of Idaho's most restrictive correctional facilities. And those complaints raised a question that few people were asking when the plea deal was announced. What happens when a person avoids death only to face decades of isolation, routine, and confinement with no possibility of release? Because for Bryan Kohberger, the sentence did not end when the courtroom proceedings were over. In many ways, that's where it began, today. We'll examine what happened after the headlines faded. We'll look at the reality of Kohberger's life sentence, the conditions of his confinement, the complaints that drew public attention, and the psychological toll that experts say can come with spending years in restrictive housing. And ultimately, we'll explore the question that continues to divide public opinion. Did Bryan Kohberger escape the harshest punishment available? Or did he enter a reality that some believe may be even worse? Long before questions about prison conditions, isolation, and life without parole, Bryan Kohberger became known for a case that captured the attention of millions across the country. In the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were killed inside an off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. The victims were 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves, 21-year-old Madison Mogan, 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, and 20-year-old Xana Kernodle. They were students, friends, siblings, daughters, and a son. They had plans for the future, families who expected phone calls, friends who expected to see them again. Instead, news of their deaths sent shockwaves through a small college town and quickly became one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in recent memory. At first, there were more questions than answers. Investigators faced enormous pressure as the case attracted national media attention. The killings appeared sudden, brutal, and difficult to explain. As days turned into weeks, fear spread throughout the community. Many residents wondered whether the person responsible was still out there. Students debated whether it was safe to remain on campus. Rumors circulated online. Speculation filled social media. And with each passing day, the demand for answers only grew stronger. Behind the scenes, investigators were working through thousands of tips, reviewing surveillance footage, analyzing digital evidence, and trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened inside the home that night. The investigation became one of the largest in the state's history. For weeks, the public knew very little about where the evidence was leading. But detectives continued building their case, piece by piece. Then, as investigators began connecting critical evidence, attention gradually shifted toward a doctoral criminology student named Bryan Kohberger. His arrest would mark a major turning point in the case, but it would not bring the story to an end. In many ways, it marked the beginning of an entirely different chapter, one that would eventually lead to a plea deal, 4 life sentences, and a debate that continues to this day. Because once the question of guilt was resolved, a new question emerged. What should the punishment be? As the case moved through the court system, attention gradually shifted away from the investigation itself and toward a different question. What punishment should Bryan Kohberger face if convicted? For months, prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty. It was a possibility that hung over every major development in the case. If convicted at trial, Kohberger could have faced execution. But before the case ever reached that point, everything changed. In a move that surprised many observers, Kohberger agreed to plead guilty. The agreement removed the possibility of a lengthy trial and eliminated the uncertainty that often comes with high-profile murder cases. It also meant something else. The death penalty was no longer on the table. Instead, Kohberger would receive 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence guaranteed that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no future release, no opportunity to return to society, and no chance of ever leaving prison as a free man. For some of the victims' families, the plea brought a measure of closure. Years of appeals and court proceedings could be avoided. The uncertainty surrounding a trial would finally come to an end. But not everyone viewed the outcome the same way. Some family members expressed frustration that the death penalty would no longer be considered. Others questioned whether a life sentence alone was enough for a crime that had devastated so many lives. The reaction extended far beyond the courtroom. Across news programs, online discussions, and social media, people debated whether justice had truly been served. Was spending the rest of his life behind bars a sufficient punishment, or should execution have remained a possibility? It's a question that continues to divide public opinion. But while the public debated what punishment was appropriate, Bryan Kohberger was beginning to experience the reality of the sentence he had just accepted. The legal battle was over. A very different chapter was about to begin, and it would unfold behind the walls of one of Idaho's most secure prisons. Once the sentencing was over, Bryan Kohberger left the courtroom and entered a world that would become his reality for the rest of his life. The headlines surrounding the case had focused on the investigation, the evidence, and the plea agreement. But now, the focus shifted to something much simpler. What would everyday life actually look like for a man sentenced to die in prison? After being transferred into Idaho's prison system, Kohberger arrived at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. The facility houses some of the state's most closely monitored inmates and operates under strict security procedures designed to control nearly every aspect of daily life. For Kohberger, the transition began the moment he entered the facility. Like other incoming inmates, he went through the intake process. Personal belongings were documented, identification procedures were completed, housing assignments were determined, and with each step, the reality of his sentence became harder to ignore. The courtroom was gone, the media coverage was fading, the legal arguments were over. What remained was prison. Day after day, year after year. According to reports, Kohberger was placed in restrictive housing, where inmates spend much of their time separated from the general prison population. The environment is heavily controlled. Movement is limited. Daily routines follow a strict schedule. Meals arrive at designated times. Recreation is regulated. Interactions with others can be significantly reduced compared to traditional prison housing. For many inmates, the adjustment can be difficult. The structure rarely changes. The surroundings remain the same, and time can begin to feel very different when every day follows nearly the exact same pattern. For Kohberger, this was no longer a temporary situation. There was no upcoming trial, no release date, no possibility of parole. This was the sentence. And while the public continued debating whether justice had been served, reports suggest Kohberger was already beginning to voice concerns about life inside the facility. Some of his earliest complaints caught public attention for unexpected reasons. They weren't focused on dramatic confrontations or major security issues. Instead, they centered on the realities of everyday prison life. At first, those complaints may have seemed minor, but they would soon offer a glimpse into the challenges Kohberger was facing as he adjusted to permanent incarceration. And as more details emerged, they began to paint a picture of just how difficult that adjustment may have been. As the weeks passed, reports began emerging about some of the concerns Bryan Kohberger was raising inside prison. For many people following the case, the complaints came as a surprise. After all, public attention had been focused on the plea deal, the life sentences, and the debate surrounding his punishment. Few expected the conversation to shift toward commissary items, dietary concerns, and everyday prison accommodations. But that's exactly what happened. Among the issues that reportedly drew attention were complaints involving commissary access and concerns related to maintaining a vegan diet while incarcerated. There were also requests connected to prison accommodations and the conditions of daily life inside the facility. On the surface, some of these complaints may have seemed insignificant, but they quickly became part of a larger conversation, because they offered one of the first public glimpses into how Kohberger was adjusting to life behind bars. And that adjustment was happening under circumstances that most people will never experience. Unlike inmates serving shorter sentences, Kohberger wasn't counting down the days until release. There was no parole hearing to prepare for, no future date to work toward. Every routine, every restriction, every inconvenience would remain part of his life indefinitely. That reality may help explain why even relatively small issues attracted attention. In prison, daily routines carry far more weight than they do on the outside. Access to certain items, food options, housing conditions, Privileges that many people rarely think about can become major concerns when they are part of every single day. The public reaction, however, was often very different. Many people viewed the complaints through the lens of the crimes themselves. Some questioned why attention was being given to prison grievances at all. Others saw the complaints as evidence that Kohberger was struggling to adjust to the reality of his sentence. Whatever the interpretation, the reports created a striking contrast. For years, the public discussion had focused on the possibility of a death sentence. Now, the conversation was centered on the realities of life imprisonment. Not dramatic courtroom battles, not legal arguments, but the day-to-day experience of living inside a maximum security prison with no possibility of release. And as more information emerged, it became clear that food and commissary concerns were only a small part of a much larger story, because the deeper challenge wasn't necessarily what Kohberger could buy or what meals were being served. It was the environment itself, and the psychological effects that can come with spending years in highly restrictive confinement. But according to researchers, the food complaints weren't the most revealing part of Kohberger's prison experience. To understand why some of Kohberger's complaints attracted so much attention, it's important to understand the environment he was living in. Because restrictive housing is very different from what many people imagine when they think about prison. While specific conditions can vary between facilities, restrictive housing is generally designed to separate inmates from the broader prison population. Prison officials often use these units for security reasons, inmate safety, institutional management, or to reduce potential risks within the facility. As a result, daily life becomes highly structured and heavily controlled. For inmates assigned to these units, much of the day is spent alone. Movement is limited. Interactions with other inmates can be significantly reduced. Even routine activities often take place under strict supervision. Every aspect of the day follows a schedule. Meals, recreation, showers, cell inspections. The routine repeats itself over and over again, day after day, week after week, month after month. For most people, it can be difficult to imagine living under those conditions indefinitely. Outside prison, life is filled with small decisions that often go unnoticed. Where to go, who to talk to, when to leave the house, what to eat, how to spend free time. Inside restrictive housing, many of those choices disappear. The structure of the institution takes their place, and over time, that loss of control can become one of the defining realities of incarceration. For someone serving a temporary sentence, there is at least an endpoint to focus on, a release date, a hearing, a milestone somewhere in the future. But for inmates serving life without parole, that calculation changes. There is no release date, no final countdown, no opportunity to start over once the sentence is complete. The routine simply continues, year after year. For prison administrators, restrictive housing serves a specific purpose. Maintaining safety and security inside a correctional institution is a constant challenge, particularly when dealing with high-profile inmates or individuals who may face unique security concerns. From that perspective, the restrictions are part of the system's effort to manage risk. But understanding why the system exists doesn't necessarily make the experience easier for those living inside it. And that's where researchers have focused much of their attention. For decades, psychologists and correctional experts have studied the effects of long-term isolation and limited social interaction. What they've found is that the impact can extend far beyond boredom or frustration. Because after enough time, the challenge isn't simply being confined to a small space. It's what that confinement can do to a person's perception of time, routine, and even themselves. And according to researchers, those effects can be far more significant than most people realize. As discussions about Kohberger's prison life continued, many observers focused on the visible aspects of incarceration: the cell, the restrictions, the complaints, the daily routine. But researchers who study long-term confinement often point to something less visible: the psychological effects. For decades, psychologists, correctional experts, and researchers have examined what can happen when a person spends extended periods in highly restrictive environments with limited social interaction. While experiences vary from person to person, several patterns appear repeatedly throughout the research. One of the most commonly discussed is the way isolation can alter a person's sense of time. Outside prison, life is naturally divided into milestones: birthdays, holidays, vacations, family events, career goals. Even ordinary routines help mark the passage of time. Inside a highly controlled environment, many of those reference points disappear. Days can begin to blend together. Weeks can feel repetitive. Months can pass with little change from one day to the next. Researchers have also documented the effects of reduced stimulation. Limited environments can provide fewer opportunities for new experiences, meaningful social interaction, and the variety that most people encounter in everyday life. Over long periods, that lack of stimulation can become a challenge in itself. Another area researchers frequently discuss is identity. Much of how people define themselves comes from their relationships, responsibilities, careers, interests, and daily interactions with others. But prison removes many of those things, especially for inmates facing life sentences. When the future no longer contains major life milestones, some researchers argue that maintaining a sense of purpose can become increasingly difficult. None of this is unique to Bryan Kohberger. These findings come from broader studies involving incarceration and long-term confinement, but they provide important context for understanding the reality of a sentence like the one he received. Because life without parole is not simply a sentence measured in years, it's measured in routines, restrictions, missed opportunities, and the passage of time itself. For someone in Kohberger's position, every year behind bars looks remarkably similar to the one before it. And unlike many inmates, there is no possibility that those years will eventually lead to release. That reality is one reason some experts argue that the true weight of a life sentence often becomes more apparent over time. The first year is one thing, the 10th year is another. The 20th year can be something entirely different. As the years pass, the challenges of confinement don't necessarily disappear. In some cases, they become more difficult to ignore. And that brings us back to the question that has followed this case ever since Bryan Kohberger accepted his plea deal. Did he avoid the harshest punishment available? Or did he exchange it for a different kind of sentence, one that unfolds day after day, year after year, for the rest of his life? Section 7. Did he choose a fate worse than death? Ever since Bryan Kohberger accepted the plea deal that removed the death penalty from consideration, one question has continued to follow the case. Did he receive a lighter punishment, or did he trade one form of punishment for another? For many people, the answer seems obvious. The death penalty is irreversible. It represents the most severe punishment the legal system can impose, and for some, avoiding execution means avoiding the harshest possible consequence. But others see the situation differently. They point to what a life sentence without parole actually means in practical terms. Not just years in prison, but decades. Decades of the same routines, the same walls, the same restrictions, the same reality waiting every morning when the cell door opens, and every night when it closes again. This is where public opinion often begins to divide. Some believe execution delivers justice more directly. Others argue that spending the remainder of one's life in prison is a far greater burden. Not because it ends a life, but because it doesn't. Instead, it requires a person to continue living with the consequences of their actions every single day. In Kohberger's case, there is no future release date to focus on. No possibility of parole. No opportunity to rebuild a life outside prison. The sentence does not gradually move toward freedom. It moves in only one direction: forward, year after year, for the rest of his life. And while opinions differ on which punishment is harsher, one reality is difficult to ignore. A death sentence reaches a final outcome. A life sentence without parole continues indefinitely. Every day becomes part of the punishment. Every year becomes part of the punishment. And as time passes, the weight of that reality can become impossible to escape. Of course, reasonable people disagree about what justice should look like in cases like this. Some believe the death penalty should have remained an option. Others believe life without parole was the appropriate outcome. Both perspectives continue to be debated. But regardless of where someone stands on that issue, Bryan Kohberger's future is no longer uncertain. The legal proceedings are over. The sentence has been imposed. And the rest of his life will unfold inside a prison system he can never leave. Which brings us back to the same question that emerged when he first accepted that plea deal. Did Bryan Kohberger avoid the harshest punishment available? Or did he enter a sentence that, for some people, may be even harder to endure? The answer depends largely on how you define punishment. And that's a debate that is likely to continue for years to come. More than anything else, the story of Bryan Kohberger's prison life exists because of what happened on November 13th, 2022. Before the headlines, before the investigation, before the arrest, the trial, and the plea deal, there were four young people whose lives were cut short. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were students with plans for the future, families who loved them, and friends who expected to grow old alongside them. No prison sentence can change what happened. No court ruling can bring them back, and no legal outcome can erase the loss their families continue to live with. What the justice system can do is determine how society responds. In Bryan Kohberger's case, that response was 4 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. He avoided the death penalty. That much is certain. What remains far less certain is whether he avoided the harsher fate. For some people, execution will always be the ultimate punishment. For others, spending decades in prison under strict restrictions, knowing there is no release date and no second chance, represents a different kind of consequence entirely. It's a debate that has existed for generations, and cases like this continue to keep that conversation alive. What is clear is that Bryan Kohberger's legal battle is over. The appeals, the speculation, and the uncertainty surrounding his future have largely been replaced by something much simpler: a daily routine, a prison cell, and a sentence that will continue for the rest of his life. As for whether life without parole is actually worse than the death penalty, people will likely continue disagreeing for years to come. But we'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe life without parole is a harsher punishment than the death penalty? Let us know in the comments below, and please keep the discussion respectful. If you found this documentary informative, be sure to subscribe to Midnight Crimefiles for more in-depth true crime stories, investigations, and criminal justice documentaries. And if you'd like to continue exploring cases that raise difficult questions about crime, punishment, and justice, check out the next documentary appearing on your screen now. For Bryan Kohberger, the courtroom chapter is over. The prison chapter has only just begun. Thanks for watching.